Officer at the Office of the OSCE Representative on Freedom of the Media. As you know, the OSCE Representative on Freedom of the Media has a unique mandate. It is the world's only intergovernmental media freedom watchdog, situated in a security organization. It was established 25 years ago, and when we look at the role that media plays in our societies today, it has changed immensely, and much of this change has come at the expense of media's ability to be conducive to democracy, peace, and security. Female journalists and female parliamentarians share the burden of regularly facing the same patterns of attacks and threats online, resulting in a worrying trend of contradicting and limiting pluralism, being fundamental for democracy. A recent study by UNESCO found that online violence towards female journalists is often a predictor of offline violence, and in some cases, even murder. Therefore, it is essential to monitor and report online violence. Only then, key responsive organizations and mechanisms can take protective actions. For this reason, I am very pleased to welcome you all here today at this joint event, which builds on previous cooperation with the OSCE and will give us an occasion to discuss the OSCE guidelines for monitoring online violence against female journalists. And now I will pass the floor to Hanna Dogovic, who is Program Officer at the OSCE and will present short technical guidelines.
Thank you, Cecilia. I am pleased to welcome you all on behalf of the OSCE International Secretariat. I would like to quickly provide an overview of today's agenda. In a moment, we will start with the opening remarks, which will officially launch this event. These will be followed by the panel on the role of national parliaments in monitoring and combating online violence against women journalists and politicians. After that, we will have an expert presentation of OSCE RFOM guidelines for monitoring online violence against female journalists that Cecilia just mentioned. And after this, we will have a lively debate among participants, keeping in focus the regional dynamics and the specific role of parliamentarians in this regard. Finally, we will have concluding remarks from the RFOM side too. Allow me now just a few technical announcements before we begin. Please note that this event is being recorded for internal purposes. It is also being live streamed. It is taking place in English language exclusively. Please note that online requests to speak should be written in the chat. My colleagues will collect all the requests and then we will give you the floor during the debate. To ensure a smooth experience, I kindly ask all participants to mute their microphone when not speaking. Likewise, please unmute your microphone only when given the floor. If possible, please keep your cameras on during the entire event so that we can see each other better. And finally, I would like to encourage all speakers from the floor to limit their interventions to maximum 3 minutes during the debate so that we can have as many speakers as possible. This is all from my side now, and I pass the floor back to Cecilia.
Thank you very much, Hanna. And now it is my pleasure and my honor to introduce Mrs. Ribeiro, the representative on freedom of the media of the OSCE. Please, Mrs. Ribeiro, the floor is yours. You're muted, unfortunately. Now.
I'm very sorry. Thank you, Cecilia. Dear members of the Parliament, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, it is my pleasure to welcome you at this joint web dialogue on countering online violence against women. I'm very pleased to see many parliamentarians here today, together with our excellent speakers, for an open debate on how to improve prevention and protection mechanisms for online violence against women. As elected lawmakers, I know that you are well aware that without diversity or pluralism, there can be no democracy. equal opportunities to free speech for all is indispensable for genuine media freedom and is the basis for peace, comprehensive security, and sustainable development. Let me reiterate in this context that there is no security without media freedom, which is the slogan I chose last year on the occasion of the 25th anniversary of the mandate I proudly serve. The sad reality, however, is that journalists in our region still face repression, restrictions, and restraint. We witness that intimidation, threats, and violence come from both state and private actors, and we see that this harassment is perpetrated online as well as offline. The online sphere poses ever more severe challenges to journalist safety, with female journalists being particularly targeted, carrying the double burden of being harassed and threatened because of their work and because of their gender. Gender-based online attacks aim at or result in denying women a public voice, leading to self-censorship or even women retreating from the public sphere, thereby depriving our societies of diverse information and inclusive public debates. This is exactly why in 2015 we started our Safety of Female Journalists online project. And this is also why we are currently developing guidelines for monitoring online violence against female journalists. With this, we will provide a more systematic monitoring and reporting system from a gender-sensitive and gender-responsive approach. This new tool will help to detect, predict, and ultimately prevent the escalation of online violence against women journalists. Let me please mention briefly the three authors of these monitoring guidelines. The leader is Julie Possetti, who is a multi-award-winning Australian journalist and academic based in Oxford. She is Deputy Vice President and Global Director of Research at the International Centre for Journalists and Senior Researcher with the Centre for Freedom of the Media at the University of Sheffield in the UK. Nabila Shabir, who is a freelance journalist and a Senior Research Associate at the International Centre for Journalists, and Diana Maynard, which I'm grateful to announce that is with us today. Diana Maynard is a computer scientist and computational linguist who works as a senior research fellow in the Natural Language Processing Group of the Department of Computer Science at the University of Sheffield. Diana will tell us more about this monitoring system in which 14 research-derived indicators guide us in tracking and recording online violence escalation. The indicators reflect the signals associated with early warning and rapid response methods designed to trigger interventions when female journalists are attacked online. I'm also very pleased that Dr. Eddie Fry and Joan Boozer are joining us today to tell us about the Canadian and Swedish examples. I'm sure your experiences of both the processes and the substance will be incredibly informative to today's discussion. It is important to hear from all of you today in this open debate, to hear about your concerns, experiences, and challenges, as well as about your initiatives and success stories. Let us use the opportunity to exchange good practices, to identify common challenges, and to discuss possible solutions. You, as parliamentarians, are an essential building block for improving the situation of women journalists and thus of media pluralism across our region. Let's together build better prevention and protection mechanisms for the female journalists within the OSCE region. I thank you for your attention and look forward to the discussions.
Thank you very much, Madam Representative. And now I will pass the floor to Hannah to introduce the panel on the role of national parliaments in monitoring and combating online violence against female journalists and politicians.
Thank you, Cecilia, and thank you, Ms. Ribeiro, for this interesting introduction. Yes, I would suggest that we move straight to the presentation by OSCE PA members. We have two speakers who will speak about the role of national parliaments and monitoring and combating online violence against female journalists and politicians. I would first like to give the floor to Dr. Hedy Fry from Canada, who is the OSCE PA Special Representative on Gender Issues. She has been appointed to this role in October 2010, and she has been reappointed in the following years. She is also the longest serving member of Canadian Parliament, and her work both at the PA and in the Canadian Parliament greatly focuses on women's equality in politics and parliaments. Dear Dr. Fry, the floor is yours.
Good morning, Anna and Teresa. Thank you for all the hard work you've been doing, Teresa, on this issue. I have watched you continue to inform us on this, and now I'm looking forward to hearing what other people are doing in their parliaments with regard to dealing with this issue. I think it's important to note that violence against female journalists have caused many of them, or 30% of them, to choose not to write about certain topics. That's actually quite disconcerting, because if we look at the press as a force for good, if we look at freedom of the press as an important issue, and the fact that women journalists bring a totally different perspective to reporting of news and the way they look at problems and the way they look at solutions and the way they report on these issues, then we're missing a big chunk of understanding of the issues from that perspective. Now, if female journalists are afraid to report, if they're afraid of harassment and threats, and some of these threats online are actually quite frightening because they have to do with sexual violence. They threaten families of female journalists. And as we all know, that as soon as your family is threatened, even though you may be brave enough to say, I'm not worried about you threatening me, but as soon as our family is threatened, people begin to clamp up and begin to worry. And so if we get female journalists out of reporting entirely, we miss a huge chunk of their ability to report on certain issues. And if they only pick and choose issues that are safe, then we don't hear from them on the other issues. And I think that this, in fact, is a core to democracy in certain countries. I mean, democracy is about freedom of the press, and the media is there to inform civil society about facts, about the truth of what is going on in their society, that allows civil society to make good decisions about how they vote, about whether they vote, about when they vote, about how they decide on public policy and how they support public policy that's being put forward by the government, or how they do not support public policy that's being put forward by the government. So this is such an important part of ensuring that democracy is strong in the OSCE PA region. In Canada, we have lumped the issue of violence against female journalists and female politicians into one problem. And we have looked at solutions to those in the same way. I think one of the things we've noted is that about 80% of female politicians within the region have reported that they have actually been threatened. That's a huge number. We, again, have the same problem. If women do not want to run for parliaments, then we don't have the kind of representation we're looking for, diversity of voices, a diversity of civil society, and especially in Canada, diversity of culture and race and language and religion and understanding of things from that perspective. So what we did in Canada is actually we had the Justice Committee and Human Rights Committee look at this issue and take steps. So they actually ran under the banner of taking action to end online hate. And they tried to look at legislative solutions and to address the propagation of hateful acts and the incitement of online hate. the committee made a number of recommendations. The first one was to improve data collection, because I gave you some statistical data, but we think that's underreported. We don't really know what the exact data is, because we have to be able to get data informs a lot of what we do. And so they talked about data collection, and they also recommended facilitating online reporting of hate crimes against female politicians and female journalists. Now, what we did do is we put in place a policy within the parliament itself that is a harassment prevention policy. In other words, parliamentarians are being trained to understand harassment from their perspective, not only as victims or survivors, but as people who actually could be harassing themselves without even recognizing that they're doing it. And so there is a parliament to staff harassment policy that came about during this recommendation of looking at the issue of female politicians and female journalists. And so all members of parliament and House officers as employers have to provide for workplace harassment and violence prevention and protection measures, as well as reporting on any investigative information and data they had. So we're looking not only at actually policies with regard to parliamentarians and their staff, and parliamentarians and each other, and parliamentarians and the media, but it also looks at clear issues of cyberbullying. We're looking at issues of harassment, spreading rumors, threatening, negatively talking to or about someone online, and actually harassment and violence threats. And so these are, reporting gives us first data and understanding how much of this is going on, and then a clear reporting mechanism. That gives us what we need, as Teresa would tell us, a kind of research that we need to be able to move forward in finding solutions to this issue. We also in Canada do something called Gender-Based Analysis Plus. And that is how we examine every single issue that occurs within the government, within certain departments, and within civil society by looking at it from a gender perspective. How does it impact men and how does it impact women? And so gender-based analysis is core to actually putting your finger on some of the problems. And so in that issue of looking at gender-based analysis, we not only look at the women journalists and women parliamentarians and civil society, but we look at how sexual orientation, language, culture, geography, ethnicity, indigeneity, meaning indigenous persons in Canada, religion, class, and income impact the way that people are treated online, especially women and men. And so we promote the use of gender-based analysis throughout every department, every facet of everything that the government of Canada and the Parliament of Canada does, not just the government, but Parliament. And I think those are some of the measures that we put in place. It doesn't mean that this has resulted in decrease in violence, but it is a way of helping people to be prepared for it, to look for it, and to report it clearly so that one can take action against it. So that's basically what I wanted to say about what we're doing in Canada. And again, I just cannot mention how important the work that Teresa has been doing and how much we need to look at this online harassment and threats to female parliamentarians and female journalists as a direct attack against democracy. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Fry. I would like now to give the floor to Mr. Johan Buser, who is the rapporteur of the OSCE PA Committee on Democracy, Human Rights and Humanitarian Questions. He is member of the Swedish Riksdag since 2014. Mr. Buser, I believe, will provide his overview of the issue of violence against women journalists and politicians from a human rights perspective. Mr. Buser, you have the floor.
Thanks a lot, dear Hannah, and it's nice to see all of you. Dear colleagues, it is my pleasure to be one of the speakers here today on such an event of important topic of countering online violence against women. I also would like to thank the OSCE PA and the Office of the OSCE Representative on Freedom of the Media for organizing this timely web dialogue just ahead our annual session in Vancouver. And speaking after Dr. Heidi Fry is never easy because she's a passionate advocate for gender equality within our assembly, and we all certainly have a lot to learn from her. However, I will take this opportunity to shed my own perspective on the issue as a rapporteur of the OSCE PA Committee on Democracy, Human Rights and Humanitarian Questions. Dear colleagues, the role journalists play in a democratic society, including the work that journalists and the media carry out, is protected under the right to freedom of expression. This right is recognized in Article 19 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and Article 19 of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, as well as in regional human rights treaties. Nevertheless, according to the International Federation of Journalists, gender-based violence among journalists is one of the most prevalent and tolerated human rights violations in the world. IFJ data shows that more than 35% of women worldwide have experienced physical and sexual violence, and between 40 and 50% of women experience unwanted sexual advances, physical contact, or other forms of sexual harassment at work. Similarly, the UN data says that globally in 2022, 87 journalists were killed, the vast majority with impunity, and 323 were imprisoned. These numbers are quite shocking. Thinking how we could best address this, I believe that one of great powers that we as parliamentarians have is to publicly condemn attacks on female journalists and work towards raising awareness of this issue within our societies. Doing so is extremely important, not only because the abuse and harassment impact women both psychologically and professionally, but because it also impacts our right to freedom of opinion and expression, which is fundamental. We must see every threat to a journalist as a direct attack on freedom of information, opinion, and expression, fundamental rights that belong to all of us. Therefore, the safety of journalists is not just a question of personal security. It is a question of the safety and well-being of our societies. Without freedom of expression, we cannot claim to be free at all. Furthermore, I believe we need to be vocal when underlining that while both male and female journalists are exposed to violence and threats to their safety in retaliation for their work, attacks on the women are gender-based and highly sexualized, both online and offline. Therefore, as public persons, we should work towards changing narratives that claim that violence against female and male journalists has the same cause and effect. It does, in fact, not. Another important challenge, in my view, is the difficulty of preventing, detecting, and addressing cases of online violence in particular. And speaking as someone who is involved in decision and legislation making back home in the Swedish Parliament, in the Swedish Riksdag, I'm well aware that the issue of online violence is not appropriately regulated in many countries. The digital sphere, including social media, are taking more and more space in our societies, yet we lack laws to regulate it properly. And dear colleagues, under international human rights treaties, states are obliged to ensure all women fully enjoy both the right to freedom of expression and the right to equality. When applied to women journalists, this means that states have the obligation to prevent, protect, and respect the right to freedom of expression, including when they are targeted in connection with their journalistic activities and with special attention to those instances where these reprisals are gendered. Therefore, I believe that we need stronger laws on the national level, which would thoroughly address all aspects of online violence. And finally, I would like to emphasize the importance of the OSCE PA as an international parliamentary forum. I believe the OSCE PA has many tools at its disposal to address online violence against women. On hand, it can propose resolutions on this topic, which should then be applied to the national legislative and policy framework. And for instance, in 2019, in the annual session back in Luxembourg, the OSCE PA has called for parliamentary oversight of all cases of attacks on journalists. In fact, in recognition of the special danger that attacks on journalists pose for democracy, the OSCE PA passed a recommendation that says encourages national parliaments to ensure effective parliamentary oversight of government's actions towards solving all cases of journalists, murders, imprisonment, and ill treatment. A similar and strengthened call related to gender attacks may be appropriate, given that such violence represents an attack on the very heart of our open and democratic societies. On the other, the OSCE PA is valuable because it can bring together parliamentarians and experts from all over the OSCE region to discuss, exchange, and identify best practices and lessons learned in dealing with the cases of online violence, which can be tailor-made and applied to different countries. I would like now to stop here as the time is running out, and as I'm very eager to hear from the expert who worked on the OSCE guidelines for monitoring online violence against female journalists, and I want to learn more about what we as parliamentarians can do to support efforts to address such violence. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Büser. It is now my pleasure to introduce Diana Maynard. As mentioned before, together with Dr. Julie Posetti and with Nabila Shabir, she is one of the authors of the guidelines for monitoring online violence against female journalists that we are currently developing in the framework of the Safety of Female Journalists online project at the Office of the OSCE Representative on Freedom of the Media. Diana will tell us more about this monitoring system, in which we have 14 research-derived indicators that guide us in tracking and recording online violence escalation. The indicators reflect the signals associated with early warning and rapid response methods designed to trigger interventions when female journalists are attacked online. So please, Diana, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Yes, so I'm afraid I'm not Julie, who led this research, who unfortunately couldn't be here. So I come at it from a slightly different angle. Basically, this is research we've been doing for a number of years now. Essentially being led by ICFJ under commission to UNESCO since 2019. And the yes, we've been working with OSCE on this monitoring guidance document. So as you all know, outside of conflict zones, this is one of the greatest threats we've faced. And so we're trying to see how we can improve what's being done here and how it can be adapted. So, as I say, we've been researching this for a long time, and we've been doing substantial research since 2019. So we're developing a set of guidelines for monitoring online violence against female journalists. As part of a forthcoming guidance tool for monitoring gender-based online violence against female journalists. So as I said, this was commissioned by the OSCE and produced by ICFJ in collaboration with us at the University of Sheffield. So we have, we've essentially developed 14 online violence escalation indicators. I'm not going to go through all of them now, but I will just give you a summary of some of the key points from this research. So on the basis of all the research we've been doing, the aim is to try and get a sense of, or rather, I want to give you a sense of what underpins the indicators that we've developed. So on the basis of the data that we've been studying, this underscores our research on the guidelines. And this is based on 9 big data case studies we've developed over the last few years involving emblematic cases of online violence against women journalists. So we've developed 9 interdisciplinary big data case studies based on regionally and globally emblematic online violence to help inform the OSCE responses. And these entail Carmen Ariztugui in Mexico. Apologize for my bad pronunciation of some of these names. Rana Ayub in India, Carol Cadwallader in the UK, Daphne Caruana Galizia in Malta. And her case is a clear example of how online threats can become online harm of the very worst kind, resulting in her death, as in the case also of Gary Lankesh in India. And then we have Ferial Hafaji in South Africa, Khada Owais in Lebanon, Maria Ressa in the Philippines, Mariana Spring in the UK, and Paulie van Wyk in South Africa. So overall, we've studied over 18 million tweets. And what we've essentially done from a technical point of view is we've collected tweets by the various journalists, and then we've studied all the responses, everybody who mentions the journalist in question, any tweet by them, and all the conversations around these tweets. And we've categorized them for abuse and different types of abuse. We've studied all kinds of data around these tweets. So, for example, what kind of abuse is it? Who is sending the abuse? What happens after a journalist sends a message that results in abuse? So, what happens to that conversation further down the line? We've looked at specific kinds of abuse, so whether it's sexist, misogynistic, racist, politically motivated, and so on. We look at things like how long does it take before abuse is sent? What happens in that conversation? What is the abuse about? And we try and look at the network of abusers. So how are people who send abuse related, and so on. So we've done these large data case studies. And this has informed the development of the escalation indicators. So we're trying to look at what kinds of violence, how can we detect when online violence might escalate into something even worse. And this is still very much work in progress, but so far from the work we've been doing, we've developed, as I say, these online indicators. So some of the key ones that we've been looking at are death and rape for threats. So this is an obvious kind of concern, especially when one is trying to pursue legal action. And these are particularly bad when they're received at scale or when they arrive in close succession. And in fact, one of the things we look at is how long does it take before abuse is sent from a journalist first sending a message. And in some cases, it's as little as 3 seconds. Then we have identifiable or suspected state or foreign state actor involvement. So this is things like extraterritorial attacks when they're online are very difficult if a state is mounting an attack outside a regional group, but we might be able to extract some kind of accountability. So an example of this would be in April 2020, a major Saudi-linked disinformation network was removed by Twitter, as well as from 4 other countries, Egypt, Honduras, Indonesia, and Serbia. BBC Persian journalists have been targeted by Iranian Stop, physically via letter dropping and online threats radiating to their families. Then we have threats associated with impunity cases. So when women journalists are threatened with injury or harm by referring to the murder of other journalists with impunity. So this is the case with, for example, Rana Ayub in India, who was threatened in reference to Gary Lankesh's murder in 2017. In Malta, we saw the same thing with Daphne Caruana Galizia's murder. Patricia Devlin in Northern Ireland was threatened with reference to another assassinated journalist, Khada Owais with Jamal Khashoggi, and so on. So again, this trend points to the need for documentation. The threat and level of the harm here is really extreme. Then we have evidence of coordinated disinformation operations. So, for example, repetitive and apparently networked false narratives. Again, we try to track how the abusive messages are connected together, so we can see signs of messages being networked and linked together. So misogynistic targeted online abuse is used as a tool of disinformation agents with a view to silencing investigations. And we see tactics deployed by networks who abuse women journalists. Another indicator is the evidence of targeted surveillance or interception. So again, this seems obvious, but the set of indicators hasn't yet been accumulated and linked in this way. So we know about things like Pegasus and features of online violence that a journalist is facing. Khadoues suffered the theft of photos from her phone, misrepresentation of photos. She observed source communications and other activities. Similarly, Carmen Aristegui in Mexico. And then long range or large scale attacks with associated risk of significant psychological harm. So what we call networked gaslighting. And this is a form of escalation with medium term impacts in terms of psychological injury. So psychological harm, including things like PTSD, need to be understood as a workplace safety issue, where you have long range attacks of constant moderate level of abuse. These can build up to inflict harm. Similarly, sudden large-scale accounts, network misogyny, where groups of male attackers typically will hurl abuse in large volumes. And this has, very significant psychological effects. And then targeted attacks on or threats against identified family members, such as children and partners. So again, this often connects to the misogynistic nature. Frequently, it's children who are targeted, which is a way of furthering the chilling effect because the risk is radiating to members of the family. And if attackers go to all that trouble, it's an indication also that they're much more sophisticated than your average kind of internet troll. So it's something, again, to be taken very seriously. And finally, intersectional abuse, which frequently features multiple layered forms of discrimination and hate speech. For example, associated with racism, sectarianism, religious bigotry, and homophobia. And these produce significantly heightened exposure and deeper impacts for women who are experiencing multiple forms of discrimination concurrently. So moving on then towards the monitoring guidance. In general, I would say our document goes into this in a lot more detail, but the primary monitoring guidance for responders is first to record the threats. So describe the threats, attach a screen grab if possible, include the URL where it's relevant, include evidence of any image-based abuse, such as memes. Identify the perpetrator, so their username or handle, location if it's known, mobile phone number, email address, and so on if they're known, real name and affiliations where they're evident. And then identify the medium and the vectors and facilitators of the threat. So are they on social media, chat apps, text message, email, and so on. Identify and monitor any hashtags being used in connection with the abuse. And we often see hashtags being used to seed these large-scale attacks. And then conduct a risk assessment for the perpetrator. So, for example, are they identifiable as a person with criminal convictions or connections? Are they associated with a state or foreign state actor? In these cases, the risk is likely to be significantly heightened. So that's basically, I say I'll run out of time, but that's in a nutshell, that's a kind of summary of our guidance tools. So I'm happy to take any questions if we have time.
Thank you. Thank you, Ms. Meinhardt. With this, we have concluded the presentations from the speakers and our expert. Before opening the debate or questions and answer sessions, let me just mention a few rules. I would kindly ask everyone to limit their comments, questions, and interventions to 3 minutes to enable as many contributions as possible. We will warn you when your time is over. Participants are kindly requested to ask for the floor through the chat function. And when given the floor, they can address the speakers by simply unmuting their microphone. Allow me also to remind you that this event mainly targets members of parliament as the main audience. That is why when giving the floor, they will have a priority. In any case, I think there is enough time and I hope that everyone will be given an opportunity to speak. Are there any requests for any question from the audience? You can also be spontaneous and simply raise your hand in case you would like to speak. I don't see anyone wishing to speak at the moment. Maybe it would be a good idea to go back to our speakers, which could maybe provide 2 or 3 key messages that they would like us to remember from today or something to highlight. Maybe I can start with Teresa Ribeiro, if you would like to share something with us.
With pleasure. Thank you very much. Thank you. Let me just very, very shortly, but I think it's important, first of all, to to point out the lack of awareness that sometimes exists regarding this phenomena. This is a problem, and as politicians, it is one of your responsibilities, definitely, to raise awareness regarding the problem of women journalists and the harassment and attacks on women journalists. So this is my first message. The second one is that we need to join forces. This is a large-scale phenomena all across the entire OSCE region, and we definitely need to join forces if you want to address this big problem. My second message. The third one is that what we are now doing, working with this very high-level team of experts, it's really to try to find the best solutions, and not the best solutions, but the best tools to help us to address this problem. And our expectation is that in the second semester, we will have the opportunity to present you the 14 indicators, to launch it officially, and to present to everyone, to the participating states, to the MPs, to the PA, so to everyone, all this monitoring guidelines with the 14 indicators for us, for allowing all of us to really look at them and to see how can we use it in our specific national contexts. Then I also would like to remind something that in a way is linked to what I said previously about the scale of this phenomena, which is, according to UNESCO, 73% of women journalists are online arrests. And in 20% of the cases, this online harassment transforms into physical violence. So this is really serious, and it is alarming. I think these percentages, these statistics really give us an idea of the seriousness of this topic. So let's work together, let's join forces, and let's give a decisive contribution to look at this phenomena seriously and to bring the solutions that we, in our different responsibilities and mandates, should bring to solve the problem. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Ribeiro. I believe your intervention has spurred some interest among our participants. And I see Ms. Amina Agazada from Azerbaijan. She would like to take the floor, please.
Thank you. Hello, everybody. Thank you for giving me the floor. I want to share some thoughts about this topic. And we proceed from understanding that media can and should play a more active role in fostering peace and security, particularly by promoting and encouraging mutual understanding, tolerance, and non-discrimination in the OSCE region. This is even more urgent in the light of the increase in the incidence of radicalization, ethnic and religious intolerance, and xenophobia, including Islamophobia across the OSCE region, as well as deliberate attempts in some participating states to abuse media and its tools by spreading disinformation, fake news, and hate speech for their own narrow political interests. OSCE Minister Council decision on the safety of journalists adopted in Milan in 2018 stipulate that participating states should condemn publicly and unequivocally attacks on women journalists in relation to their work, such as sexual harassment, abuse, intimidation, threats, and violence, including through digital technologies. The participating states and their authorities are called to enable safe working conditions and ensure the safety of journalists by inter alia bringing to justice all those responsible for threats or crimes against journalists. Azerbaijan attached high value to this issue, providing enabling environment for women, including women journalists, to unfold their full potential as integral part of our society. Azerbaijan has been one of the first few countries with a predominantly Muslim population to ratify the International Convention on Women's Rights and Gender Equality and adopted law dealing with the eradication of gender inequality and violence of any sort against women. Over the last 3 decades, Azerbaijan has made considerable progress in empowering women. At present, gender equality and equal and balanced participation of women in social and public life remain among the priorities of the government policies. Azerbaijan has a solid track record of providing an able environment for women in media to unfold their full potential as an integral part of our society. Gender equality is among the priorities of the government's policies. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much. And since we don't have other requests to speak from the participants, maybe I will ask Dr. Fry to comment on this last intervention, but also, since you mentioned before, the importance of having women in the public sphere. And I think this is also what links our work, parliamentarians and journalists together. How can we keep them in the public sphere?
I think this is a very difficult problem. And it was identified by our speaker from University of Sheffield, that the problem is, for me, and I would love to hear what Teresa has to say about this, is how do you identify online perpetrators? Because they could be there under all sorts of names. They could be state actors, but they're under some disguise of non-state actors. They could be, so in order to deal with perpetrators, you have to identify them. And I think University of Sheffield, Diana talked about identifying. My big question, and I think that's where we talk about, how do you put the bell around the neck of the cat so the mice can tell when it's coming? It's to be able to identify. And how do we identify, given that online can be such a place where people can hide themselves behind all sorts of titles and names, et cetera, et cetera. That is the biggest issue for me. And not only against female journalists, but against women parliamentarians as well. The hidden sources are what we need to find. Otherwise, you cannot bring anyone to justice. You cannot call out groups if you don't know who they are. What is your answer to this, Ms. Maynard or Teresa? I'd love to hear you. It's a difficult question, and maybe you have some answers, because that's something we're all struggling with. How do you identify?
Yeah, so if I can respond to that, you're absolutely right, and it's very hard. In a lot of cases, you simply can't identify them because people do hide. But the surprising thing, I think, that's come out of our research is how often it is possible to identify the people behind it, and the fact that they don't hide. It's really quite surprising, and we've seen in some cases. We've seen people even putting things in their Twitter bios that indicate their particular hatred for a particular journalist. We've seen this with Mariana Spring in the UK, and we've seen people, actually writing things in their Twitter bio about that. We also see people who've been banned from Twitter for sending abuse coming back with very, very similar usernames, identical Twitter profiles, and so on, and sometimes even bragging in their Twitter profile or in a pinned post that they've been banned and they're now back again, which is it's quite astonishing. But really, a lot of people don't hide, and they're actually quite almost proud of the fact that that they're able to be there sending abuse. So there are also, we can't always, when we can't identify the person, what we can identify is groups of people who are connected together, and we can see, even if we don't know exactly who they are, we can see groups of people, and for example their particular affiliations, we can see that they're strongly connected to organizations, governments, whatever. We can look at these networks with sophisticated tools, and we can start to see, as I say, groups of people who may be connected, formally connected, or they may be kind of slightly more informally connected. And when we talk about networked abuse, in this sense, that we see, for example, the same people send abusive messages in reply to particular messages from the journalists and so on. And we see them when they often send the same abuse to the same person, then we can see these kind of networks going on. And that again gives us information. We're also looking at the moment at geolocation. So again, I mean, one of the indicators I didn't talk about was physical proximity to the target. Again, this is tricky because we don't always have that information, but when we do have it, we can start to look at, again, people who are physically close to each other or close to our target.
Thank you. Teresa, did you have something to say?
Yeah, I would like to comment on what Diana just said, because I think it's important. And one of the things is that people that surprisingly, they don't care. they openly do that, and it means that they feel that there is an impunity atmosphere. And this is the first problem, precisely, that it's not something that is socially rejected. So this is the first thing. And again, that's the reason why that we need to raise awareness at all levels, and also at the broader level of society as a whole. This is a problem of our society. Without women in the public space, we do not have a healthy democracy, that's for sure. So we need to ensure that women could fully participate in the life of our communities, of our society. So this is the first thing. That's the reason why awareness is so important. The second thing, and regarding what Diana said about, okay, there are means to track the messages, to geolocalization, to the groups that are in a way together spreading this kind of messages. We need to train police, investigative police too. So this is a problem that to be properly addressed needs to mobilize different stakeholders and really to at this different stakeholders, and at the same time to involve the whole society. And I think this is an important message. You know, in our project, in our soft jaw guide, resource guide, we had a first phase where we of research, and then in the second phase it was clear what kind of stakeholders we need to mobilize to address this issue, to address this problem, and they are clearly identified. And the politicians, the judiciary, the police, so they are clearly identified, and it's up to us to connect the dots, to do our work. And really to spread the message.
If I may just comment quickly, I think one of the problems that some of us see is the fact that you take the normal media, you know, television, radio, newspapers, etc. They actually are regulated to the extent that many of them cannot issue false messages, cannot issue threats, cannot libel people, because then you can take them to court. You can identify them and you can actually take them to court. The thing about the internet is that it is not as regulated. One cannot actually say, well, now I know that you have been doing this and we're going to do something to you. There isn't that same regulation. How do we go about regulating the internet without dampening freedom of speech? This is a big question that goes on, for instance, in our country. If you try to regulate the internet, everyone says you're trying to stop freedom of speech. And so I just would hope that some of you could answer that. And I also wanted to recognize Roberto Montella, who's always faithfully at these meetings. He's always interested. He's always participating. Welcome, Roberto. Anyway, so if you could tell me about how we do this, I would be interested.
I would love to have a solution to present it here to you, you know, but unfortunately it's very complicated and really requires a global approach because the scale of the internet is a global one. There are important initiatives going on, like Internet for Trust by UNESCO. UNESCO is working on it, is trying to create also guidelines to this Internet for Trust, but it's a long way to go. And one of the problems of why it is so complicated is because there is a divide. there is a big divide, you know, and it's very interesting because it's more the global south that is very much against any possible regulation. And why? Because we have lots of authoritarian regimes. Many of them are in the global south, unfortunately also everywhere in Europe and everywhere. And you know, people coming from the global south, they are very, very suspicious of having any initiative to regulate to regulate internet, because they see that in a continuously shrinking space, information space, internet is still a window, an opportunity to allow voices to be heard. So this is one problem. At the same time, we can see that there are other efforts, and also in Europe with DSA, Digital Service Act, and trying really to introduce some regulation in order to prevent the most extreme cases. But it's difficult. It will continue to be a topical issue, definitely, and you are absolutely right. But there is still a long way to go till we will have a global regulation to internet. It will be extremely difficult, but I'm convinced that it will happen. And this is, you know, I was in Paris in the presentation of the guidelines for internet for trusts, and there it was very interesting to see the divide in the audience. But at the same time, and I do remember that Maria Ressa shipped the Nobel Prize awarded, and she was very clear: we need a global regulation for internet, and she was very clear, and I think she is right. But there is a long, long way to run. But we need to continue to work on it, and to see it as an ultimate goal, and in the meantime, really taking the steps that at least allow us to minimize the problem, to take measures that can help us to address the more pathological symptoms, if I may say, like that, of this kind of phenomena.
Thank you.
If I can add to that, so I mean, Teresa's absolutely right, and it's a very complex problem, and I think coming at it from a research point of view and from the technical point of view, I mean, one of the biggest problems is that it's seen as a black and white problem, right? This is acceptable or this is not acceptable, and it's a technical problem as well of physically, but you know, being able to detect problematic speech online, and to separate, you know, what's acceptable and what's not. And it's not a black and white solution. Okay, it's a very complex issue, as we know. And until now, you know, frequently these things are monitored as well in terms of counts, right? It's, you know, these things are, it's counted as black or white. This is abuse, this is not abuse, this is, you know, disinformation, whatever. And it's much more complex than that. And we need to understand much more about the nature of these kind of conversations and what's going on online. So we have to understand the whole context around everything, rather than making snap decisions which are not actually useful, because, you know, they're not always correct. they cause often more problems than they're worth. And so this is very hard to put into legal terms, but the more we can do research to understand the whole context, and to monitor actually what's going on and to understand in a lot more detail, the closer we can come to resolving this problem. So it's a long-term problem, and the kinds of things that we and many other people are doing with these kind of analysis, with the guidelines, and so on, are, I think, some of the first steps in going down this route.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks to everyone. Is there any other request for the floor? Would anyone like to add anything? Our Secretary General, Mr. Roberto Montella, please.
Thank you, Anna. As Eddie mentioned that I was here, I think this is a big success, this meeting that you've organized. I think it's very good the way you also interact between yourselves. I think for many of us, it was also a learning exercise. You know, we don't need to ask questions or all of us make an intervention. Sometimes it's just good that three people who speak with authority on this issue can just interact between them, and the rest of us learn from you. I really appreciate the initiative that was taken. I'd like to welcome Teresa, who is a dear friend, and thank you very much, Teresa, for dedicating time to us. Our officers work very closely. I see Cecilia is running from Vienna this exercise. Cecilia also worked for the Parliamentary Assembly. As you all know, your office is also a direct emanation of one of the annual declarations of the Parliamentary Assembly. We were the first ones who actually gave the idea of establishing an office for the freedom of the media. And I think that this is the way you have conducted your office, Teresa, shows on the success that this initiative that started from a resolution of the Parliamentary Assembly, but throughout the years has strengthened itself. You have tackled this issue from many different aspects. I'm happy that the Parliamentary Assembly in the past has passed resolutions. John Boozer mentioned those. This is a little bit the contribution that parliamentarians can bring to this. And I think we are doing our part. And Eddie Fry is an authority in this department. You will find Eddie in every of these events, and also always speaking with authority and also presenting a lot of resolutions and documents in the past. So I think we've done our part. But I think you've tackled this issue from a legal perspective, you know, how to go after the perpetrators of this. And of course, it's an issue of sanctioning, or it's an issue of investigation, how you find out through the internet, or where should the internet be regulated or not. But I mean, what is worrying is really the statistics that you gave, Teresa, about how much violence there is online vis-a-vis female journalists in general. And even more worrisome, how much of this translates into actually then physical implementation of those threats. And you know, it's not necessarily connected to journalists, but in Italy in these days there is so much in the Italian press about violence against women in general, and I really don't know. I mean, what you said. We need to raise awareness. I mean, really here we need to start from schools, and all of us learn that we need to have respect for women, be it journalists or be it any other profession in general, because I mean, violence is really, I mean, I'm saying a banality here, but I mean, it's really worrisome, the figures you are presenting. So it was a very good exercise for all of us to learn from. And for me, when we talk about, you know, safety of journalists in general, not only female, I mean, it's a dear issue, very close to me. Probably, Teresa, you know, I mean, when I worked in the Balkans, I was very close with a journalist friend of mine, and was a victim of myself and him, and he was shot dead in front of me. So I've always, since the time I was in the Balkans, always felt very close to the safety of journalists in general. Now we're talking about women here in an online method, but I mean, I think we really need to protect journalists. We need to protect free media. This is a contribution that we do to our democracies and to our institutions. So I mean, thank you very much for your work, Teresa, in protecting journalists in general, in this case, female journalists, and Eddie, for all the work that you do in strengthening and empowering women in all spheres of society. Thank you very much. And Anna, great.
Thank you. Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot, Roberto, for this very kind words. Thank you. And thank you very much for being with us today. I think it's a strong message.
Thank you. And I'm sure whenever the guidelines are ready, we would be more than happy to share them with all our members. I think they could be very useful on a national level. And of course, we would be more than happy to organize similar events in the future and to discuss maybe the guidelines in detail after they're published. If nobody would like to add anything more, maybe I can pass the floor to my dear colleague Paloma Madrigal, who is an associate project officer at the RFOM, and she's in charge of the SOFJO project, as she would like to provide some concluding remarks.
Thank you very much, Hannah. As we come to the end of this gathering, I would like first to extend my gratitude to all the distinguished parliamentarians and delegates who have participated in this OSCE joint event. Also, I would like to extend my gratitude to the excellent speakers and to my colleagues from the OSCE Parliamentary Assembly and from the RFOM office. Our time together has been truly inspiring and productive, filled with meaningful discussions and valuable insights, very important for the SOFJO project. During our deliberation, we have had the privilege of announcing one particularly notable initiative, the forthcoming SOFJO monitoring guidelines for online violence against female journalists. As we heard today, this innovative system aims at tracking and recording online violence and therefore preventing escalation. I would like to highlight that you, parliamentarians and delegates, are key stakeholders in the SOFJO project. Through these discussions, we have reaffirmed our collective responsibility to support female journalists and freedom of the media. Therefore, let us carry forward the spirit of collaboration and remain persistent in our dedication to the objectives of the SOFJO project. Please feel free to contact me or anyone in the RFOM office for further information on this project or other projects. May the connections made here today continue to create a positive cooperation. And thank you very much for your participation. I wish you all a good evening and continued success in your future endeavors. Thank you.
Thank you. I believe we can close the meeting. Thank you all.
Thank you. Thanks a lot. Thank you, Dr. Eddie Fry.
Thank you.